Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. On today's show, we have Rabbi Michael Harvey. He is the author of Let's Talk, A Rabbi Speaks to Christians. He's an ordained rabbi. He has led congregations and served as a hospital chaplain. Rabbi Mike is passionate about social justice, interfaith cooperation, and bringing deep Jewish learning to the lay public. Rabbi Mike, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
So this is kind of my standard question I ask everybody. How did you relate to religion the first 18 years of your life?
So I grew up in a Jewish household, a conservative Jewish household. And when I say conservative, I don't mean the Republican or political party. I mean conservative Judaism, which is sort of in between. At the time, it was in between Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. 40 years later, there's quite a bit more complexity to it. But I went to a Reform synagogue, and so my mother was pretty observant. She came from an observant household. My cousins are Orthodox, and some even moved to Israel, but it was definitely more of an observant family. We kept up a little bit, but certainly we had we followed kashrut law with things being kosher for the most part when we were there, and we went to synagogue quite often for Shabbat services. And I went to the synagogue preschool, the kindergarten enrichment, Hebrew school, Sunday school, the whole thing. I was in the confirmation class. I became bar mitzvah before that. Was part of the youth group, and was really involved with all of that about until like the last couple of years of high school, where it started to lose its. It just wasn't as much fun. I don't think. I think I was looking forward towards college and that sort of thing, and I ended up going to college in Boston University, and they had a huge Hillel at the time, but that Hillel is a very different organization than the Union for Reform Judaism. And so all the great experiences that I had in Reform Judaism, I couldn't really find anything in Boston. And so towards the end of my teen years, I sort of took more of a backseat to Judaism in general. But first 16 years of my life were pretty heavy in Jewish observance.
When you were becoming less interested, do you think it was just time of life, or was there something more going on there?
Oh, well, from a personal point of view, my mother passed away when I was 15. My father was diagnosed with cancer when I was 17. There was a great deal of what the heck's going on situations there. And, another teenage sort of adolescent stuff. And I think it all just started to sort of mix together, and it just wasn't as easy anymore. So I think some of it was developmental and some of it was situational in terms of what was going on with my family. And I just sort of lost interest in the whole thing. I think I was resentful after my mother passed away and my father got sick. And I remember distinctly even speaking to a rabbi about it, one of my favorite rabbis at the time, and just being like, this doesn't make sense anymore. And he's like, yeah, I get it. There's not much that you can say that, in Judaism when that happens. We're not big on those one-liners that you hear in Christianity. if you're in Judaism and you're starting to doubt the existence of God, that's a good thing. You're figuring things out on your own, and you'll be okay. And that's pretty much what happened. But I think, moving to college, moving away for the first time, being very much on my own, I think I wanted to try and reinvent myself, and so I didn't know what to do with that, and I just sort of let it slip to the side.
Totally, and I'm sorry for your loss. It's never easy at any age, but especially that young. Yeah, so eventually your interest was renewed because I call you Rabbi Mike. So kind of what rekindled that?
So I'm what you call a second career rabbi. So there was a while before I got back into this. I graduated from Boston University in '04. You know, I was a psychology major, but I did every once in a while take a couple Jewish courses. There was some historical stuff that I liked. I did an internship at the Holocaust Museum in Battery Park, and then of course I graduated and sort of forgot about it. It was always in the back of my head. It would pop up from time to time. It was always something I had a passion about, but I couldn't figure out what, and where that would fit in. I remember, going to high holiday services up in New York and just being a little bored, like it wasn't really doing anything for me. And I guess I was just focusing elsewhere. But uh, in 2008, this was 4 years after I graduated, I was working in what we call the secular world. Um, again, a lot of uh, I guess, sort of unfortunate events happened. And, this was the recession. So my department got liquidated. I moved overseas and then I came back and I was just sort of lost. And I went to, I think, a Rosh Hashanah service in 2008, sort of on a whim. Someone had tickets and they couldn't use them and they gave them to me. And I saw these two rabbis up on the bima, up on the pulpit, sort of speaking, and I started to look back at what my passions were, right? Teaching, understanding people, working with people, Jewish ideas and Jewish history and Jewish ritual, not from a particularly religious point of view, but from an educational point of view. And and so that sort of led me on the path uh, towards the rabbinate. And I went to Israel for like 6 months to learn Hebrew. You have to have a college level 2-year college level Hebrew to even apply to seminary. And so, or you can go to Israel and learn, immersion for like 6 months. So I did that and I applied and got in and recognized pretty clear that part of it was the right choice and part of it was the wrong choice. Everyone who was like super spiritual and feeling things and prayer and all of that I couldn't relate to them at all. But I still felt this huge connection, when we would go on archaeological digs, or we would read about, I was in Jerusalem, walking around and seeing true history and that sort of thing. And when I got back, we spent 1 year in Jerusalem and 4 years in one of the campuses. The campus I chose was in Cincinnati, Ohio. I really connected with the academic part of it. And it's a very academic campus, a lot of PhD work, a lot of biblical literacy, biblical scholarship, that sort of stuff. And I recognized that I was extremely interested and passionate about, from an academic point of view, unpacking Judaism and religion in general. And I spent those 4 years honing those skills. and became sort of an expert in that after 5 years of study and a master's degree and all of that, and recognized pretty soon that I wasn't done learning. So I ended up, while I was a congregational rabbi, pursuing my PhD as well, really sort of unpacking the intellectual side and challenges of it. And that to me has always been the interest, not so much on the, I guess what you would call observance side, which is, I guess, strange to hear because I was a congregational rabbi for 5 years, and I led people in prayer for 5 years. But I just never connected with that again. I think I felt it a little bit when I was a kid, but I don't think I ever got back there. And I made peace with that. The fact that Judaism to me as a rabbi is about intellectual pursuit. And I go back and forth on the existence of God, every year.
Yeah, I mean, good. But there's a I think that happens in some people's Christian journeys too. I went off to study to be a pastor, and I was kind of a little bit more on the touchy-feely side somewhat, but I
Yeah,
wanted to be coherent. And like
right.
I was kind of struck by it feeling like you had to kind of go one way or the other. You either had to be like this super rigid theologian or like a touchy-feely, happy-go-lucky pastor, and it didn't feel
Yeah,
like there was much space in between.
I think that's fair. We have a little bit more wiggle room in Judaism, but certainly both sides of those exist. But I think it is. I think I still surprise people when I tell them I'm a deist, or like I don't really think about God or talk about God. It's not really involved in, or like, you will not see me at services. People ask me like, what synagogue do you go to? I'm like, oh God, no, thank you. Like, one, I find it, I know so much now about the liturgy and the history and stuff like that, but also I've led my own pulpit for long enough that all I do is criticize, whoever is up there, like, oh, I wouldn't have done that or whatever it is. So I can't stand going to synagogue anymore.
Well, I always joke that the Christians I get along with are the ones who don't go to church. Like I think there is something like about that about going to that structure that almost can feel more subservient than individual, I guess, and it can feel like, why am I doing here? Like why am I doing this if I don't have to? Especially if you have like studied the material, it feels very like silly almost sometimes.
I agree with that. That's mostly on the Christian side. There's very little
Yeah.
subservience in Judaism. However, I will say that um, the I can study and teach from an academic point of view about the rubric of the service and the liturgy and all this sort of stuff. But I do, well, at least I did until I got sort of jaded. I did sort of buy into the idea of, certainly from a persecuted minority point of view, that Jews can find some connection and community in synagogues, whether it's in the sanctuary or elsewhere. And, from a historical point of view, the synagogue affiliation and attendance was at its highest in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, right? I mean, if everybody's after you, you want to be with people who who are like you. And so for the last, 5 to 7 years, I see a little bit more of that, and I think there is benefit to that. Um, but I also think that there's such a simplistic understanding of Judaism and worship and God that is presented in the sanctuary that I worry about it. I worry about my fellow Jews for not studying the right stuff. And as much as I tried in my sermons and in my adult education, it still was very high register and very complicated, and actually sort of made some people uncomfortable. Well, all of that productive discomfort, at least I thought it was productive. But
Hmm.
yeah, so I understand from a Christian point of view, certainly with the creeds and the all
Yeah,
those sort of things, it can be very can make people uncomfortable.
definitely. Do you think being kind of on that more intellectual side that relate like so I read your book, the Let's Talk a Rabbi Speaks to Christians, and I loved it by the way. Excellent.
Thank you.
It's obvious that you have a passion for interfaith dialogue. Why
Yes,
do you think that passion comes from the more intellectual side? Where do you think that passion comes from?
100%. I mean, if I think that I mean, hatred is the child of ignorance, and religion, both, I mean, Judaism, Christianity, whatever religion in the world, at least in the West. I don't want to disparage all of those wonderful, peaceful Eastern religions, but in the West, religions thrive on ignorance, and like the less you know, the more you can agree to, and that sort of thing. And so, our texts and our liturgies and our creeds or deeds or whatever it is can be extremely problematic, as history has shown. And with just a little more intellectual discovery, a little more academic training to look at, um, things like historical distance, cultural repertoire, differences in morality, translations, these sorts of things, extremists would not have a place to host themselves. You know, if this sort of information, like the information that's in my book, was mainstream, it'd be and understood, which I tried to make it extremely relatable and accessible, then people would, I think, Judaism and Christianity would look very different, in a good way. But I do think that my passion for interfaith work comes from the fact that people should be more informed. And uninformed people usually end up in mobs with torches and killing each other. And my book is sort of a small step to try to fix that issue for people who are good intentioned, well intentioned, and don't know how damaging some of the texts or liturgy or uses of things like that have been from a Christian point of view. And once they know it, they have all these aha moments. They're like, oh my goodness. And that sets them on a path of, my book is not exhaustive by any means, right? My job was to read all those hundreds and hundreds of books so that you didn't have to. But hopefully, my book sets people on a course of study, of saying, like, I really liked when, Rabbi Mike talked about this. I wonder if there's more on the subject, and go learn, and that's okay, because the rabbi said it's okay, and sort of go from there. But yes, that's where a lot of my passion comes from, is self-preservation and preservation of each other.
Absolutely. I feel like I relate to you on this in so many ways. When I wrote my book, which was The Cult of Christianity, I'm unoriginal. I just name everything that.
That's
Um,
awesome.
it it was like well, so first off, I was frankly, I was kind of in the middle of my deconstructing. Probably should have waited a few months to write it.
Right.
But like it was like I wanted to tell people, I was like, this is what churches are doing right now. I just studied to be a pastor. I just saw it with my own two eyes.
Yeah.
And there was that kind of like, it wasn't really to be like, you know F those Christians, or like this whole thing is
Right.
terrible. Like it really was. I was like, I don't think people understand, especially people who maybe have never been to church, what's going on in there. And so that was kind of like, I wanted, yeah, it's that preservation. There's a lot of motivation there. And it is funny because the most common, maybe not the most common, but one of the most common things, my critics will say is, if you hate Christianity so much, why do you still talk about it? And I'm like, for the
Please.
very reasons you're bringing up. I'm like, because it affects culture. I think there is a way for there to be like an ethical Christianity. I'm not quite sure how, but I think there probably is a way, and that very smart, caring people can probably figure that out. Um, but it
Yeah.
it does take unveiling some of this stuff, and you're right. Ignorance is definitely the linchpin of all of this. Right? It's just even the information is out there, but there's also misinformation out there. So you do kind of have to find credible sources who have, done the work and gone through the process.
I agree. And, I hear that sort of stuff all the time I hear lots of things like, why would I listen to you about Christianity? You're not Christian. And I'm like, well, that's just your internal cult talking. But also, people who say that, like, if you hate it so much, why are you talking about it? And the question, I mean, it's just very tribal. It's very sort of like, you're out, so get out. And there's very little in between of just like, actually, I'm interested in this stuff, and you know what, maybe you know, this is a good thing, but it strikes them in their bits of fear of, well, what happens if I start to unravel, and this goes away? And I get that from Orthodox Jews as well, as a Reform Jew and as a biblical scholar. They're like, well, what does it mean if the Torah it didn't come down from Sinai? I'm like, well, it means lots of things, but that's a longer story, but I think it's hard to break people away from the what I call the fortune cookies, the one-liners of, this is how it is, and here's this thing, and this is the response, and that's it, and that's supposed to make you happy. And if it doesn't make you happy, that's your fault.
Not to keep agreeing with you, but yeah, I mean, like, I really do think it is a lot of that, fear driving people to simplicity, right? Like, if I can just make
Yes.
it simple, I can be less afraid. I think that's a very real thing. Since you're the first rabbi I've interviewed, I was like, well, I should probably talk about the Hebrew Bible / the Old Testament, which I understand are slightly different, but there's enough
Yeah.
crossover to talk about it. Well, for the first probably overarching question that probably needs to be addressed is, can any form of Christianity be coherent without some knowledge of Judaism?
Here's what I'll say. Christianity could exist just fine without using our texts. It's a beautiful Greco-Roman story about a god who sends his son, who has a son with a human, just like, Zeus used to do or whatever, and, comes to Earth, and then, and then there's resurrection. I mean, it's very like pagan in essence. And if they completely did away with every aspect of Judaism, it would be a perfectly fine religion, and they probably would leave most people alone. The fact that most Christians today are living in a sort of in between phase where the only thing they know about Judaism is through the lens of Christianity, which is completely wrong. Also, the legitimacy of Christianity hinges upon the idea that the Jews shouldn't exist. The fact that Jews exist challenges the legitimacy of Christianity in general, by their own words. And so, what happens is, even the most good-natured and progressive Christians, if you push them hard enough, there is a breaking point where the existence of Jews is problematic for them, and Judaism in general. The fact that we're still here, and the fact that we disagree with them, and it's just a mishmash now. Certainly with the 40,000 denominations, but even before that, it was a mishmash of Judaism, Gnosticism, paganism, all these sort of things. And it's hard to tell where and what Judaism is for the average Christian. We mostly serve as an idea for them, not really a real person. Most of them know nothing about Judaism in general, only about first century Judaism through the lenses of the gospel, which is extremely ahistorical and anti-Jewish. And so their relationship with Judaism has always been very iffy, and easily swayed off the cliff into genocide and anti-Semitism. Very easy push to get there. And so it's a weird situation. The fact that we exist, the fact that we still exist, and the fact that we disagree, all of that is extremely problematic to Christianity. And if Christianity would just sort of let go of Judaism in general, I think it would be a lot better. It would look more like, like Eastern religions. Or if they embraced and understood Judaism more, it would be a much friendlier religion. But they're not willing to do either, typically.
Hold on to that thought, because later on I'm going to bring up why I think they must hold on to Judaism.
Okay.
For bad reasons. But
Right.
So let's get into more kind of technical things. So what are some, fundamental or structural or maybe even stylistic differences between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament?
Well, I think, and I talk about this in my book extensively in my chapter that called "The Differences in Our Canons." The idea that we have to do away with as much as possible is that sort of one-liner quote of, well, we share the same Bible. We don't. We share very different Bibles. The Hebrew Bible versus the Roman Catholic Old Testament, the Protestant Old Testament are different books. And when I say different books, I mean different books. The order in which the books are in, the manuscript that was used to translate is different. So there's.
Can you speak specifically about that? Because I feel like that's an area that a lot of people don't know.
Sure. So, a little history in that there are and have been multiple manuscripts of what we would call the Torah or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the construction of it, and then later the choosing through the manuscripts and what's been lost and what has been there. So the central manuscript that Jews use is what's called the Masoretic text, or the MT. And I highly recommend to everyone that they get a copy of the Biblios Stutargentia, which is basically a Bible that it's in Hebrew, but on the right in the column, it'll show all the manuscript differences. There's 4 or 5, whether it's the Septuagint, the Vulgate, this other manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can see all the differences in the manuscripts. Now, why is that important? What's important is, in regards to our discussion, is that when the Septuagint was written, or translated rather, we know by looking from the Hebrew and looking at the Greek that the men who were translating the Bible into Greek from Hebrew were not using the MT, the Masoretic text. We know that because there's way too many, not just scribal errors, but there's no way that certain translations came from the MT. And this was reinforced later when we saw manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls that more matched some of the translations from the Septuagint, meaning that the manuscript that was translated into Greek was most likely more like some of the ones from Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls than the Masoretic text. Neither one is right or wrong. They're just different manuscripts. And so what you start to get from there is 2 things. One, it's impossible to translate something so complex into another language. And when I say that, not just the Bible, I mean in general, right? If anyone has ever bilingual or trilingual and had a conversation with someone who's bilingual or trilingual, and said the words, "There's no real English translation for this," or "I can translate it for you, but it means this, 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 this." In other words, not one word. So the people who translated the Hebrew into the Septuagint had to make a choice within the ambiguity of the Hebrew. And that necessarily was not what the Hebrew intention was. They had to make a choice of one. And that set it down the path towards this game of telephone, from Greek to Latin and the Vulgate, and to the many English translations. So what a Christian opens up, whether it's the Roman Catholic version or the Protestant version, looks completely different from that of what a Jew opens in the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. That is to say nothing of the fact that in the Roman Catholic Old Testament, they include Apocrypha or the Deuterocanon, all kinds of things that were not included in the Hebrew Bible, such as Tobit, Judith, Maccabees, those sorts of things. And even in the Protestant Old Testament, things are out of order. And the Christians love that because and use that idea of the Septuagint order, because the prophets come last in the Septuagint, and all of that helps lead up to the theology that would bring on within the New Testament. The Hebrew Bible stands alone and doesn't lead up to anything. And those are just some of the, and my book goes into specific examples of how we know that, ideas that you can see very easily in a very sort of cool way. And it goes into more complex aspects of that. But that is basically something that every Christian should know, is that the Old Testament is a different book, from a theological, translation, order, what books there are, point of view. And so it is inherently incorrect to say we share the same book.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear, like, I went to Bible college to study to be a pastor. Like, we talk about all of this at Bible school, but you'll almost never talk about this at church.
Never. Yeah.
And that's fascinating, right? Because you almost get this idea, like, you might have a pastor who will say something vague like, "Well, this was the Jewish Bible," and then you're like, "Well, why do we use it?" And then they don't preach from it very much, and it can be very confusing why it's even in there.
Yes. Yes.
In either the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, should the stories that are in there be considered history or folklore or something else?
Well, I think that if we're going to answer that question, we need to make sure that we look at the Hebrew Bible, with the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament in the correct way. The Hebrew Bible is a library, not one book, right? It spans thousands of years of multiple authors in multiple places with multiple theological ideas. You have the Torah versus some of the what quote unquote historical books and the prophetic books, quote unquote. Then we have the writings later, and so I can't cast a wide brush over everything in there. Some of it is not historical at all, because it's poetry, it's songs, it's whatever it is, or wisdom literature. Some of it attempts to be somewhat historical, from what we would say sort of a primitive point of view, or a skewed, sort of histories written by the victor sort of way, with an agenda, and some of it is mythology and allegory, meant to teach and tell a story. What separates a biblical scholar from a fundamentalist or biblical literalist rather, is um, is that we understand that not just every book of the Bible or every book of the Torah even was written, you know, with a particular agenda, but parts of those books as well contain multiple authorship, multiple Near Eastern legends that have been switched around or inserted or redacted or whatever it is. That by the time the entire Bible, Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, was codified, it was first century CE. It took thousands of years. And each one of those people, whether it's the author, the editor, the priest, the school of thought, the redactor, the canonizer, they all had agendas, conscious or subconscious agendas. The same thing happens in the New Testament. Everything has a reason to be written. Everything has a lesson to be told. To view, or well, let me put it this way, to ask the question, did this really happen, is missing the entire point of the Bible. That was never the question meant to be asked. The question to be asked was, how does this affect our tribe? What does this mean in terms of our identity? What does this mean for the past, the present, the future? What are we supposed to be learning from this? What does God want from us, or what are the priests telling us rather what God wants from us? Who benefits from this? Why is this in the canon? Not who wrote it and did it happen. Anonymous writing was a huge part of the Near Eastern life. No one cared who wrote it. There were no copyright laws. If you wanted something to sell, you'd use what's called pseudepigrapha. If you were in, in the pre-exilic times, and you wanted to sell something, you said your name was Isaiah. Everyone read Isaiah or Jeremiah, right? None of that mattered, right? And you could write profiting or prophetic writing 100 years after something happened and prophesize it and say this was, and at that time you could say we found this book, and no one would know the difference. Everyone, only the literati and the elitists could read, let alone write. And so if someone told a story, they could say it was for however long ago. But in general, what I tell people is the books of the Bible were to be told around the campfire, and take away from those as you would. They were never meant to be a history book. And it's such a fundamentally easy truth to discover and scary idea for people. Because they start going into, well, if this doesn't mean this, is it meaningless? Is it not holy anymore? Whatever. You've missed the entire point of Near Eastern literature. And if all you have to do is study Babylonian and Egyptian and Ugaritic and Mesopotamian, and you'd understand how powerful this was before the late idea of divine authorship, and perfection and divinely inspired and historical. All of those are very late ideas, meant for adherence rather than the very carefree tribal idea of this is our people, these are our stories, not this is our history.
Yeah, so many good points. I mean, one of the biggest points that I'll harp on a lot is just that idea of literacy, right? Because most people in the US with a basic education understand that people have not been literate for a very long time,
Right.
like that it's relatively recent. Most people understand that, Christian or not. So I'm like, so we're talking about thousands of years ago. Like,
Yes.
there's no like discipline of verification. There's not like journalists investigating a piece for 50 years to figure out if it's legit or not. None of that's happening. And yeah, you're right. There's no copyright laws. So yeah, the quickest way to get your stuff out there would be who's a name everyone knows,
Right.
Yeah, so there's definitely elements of that. I do understand, coming from a Christian background, why the idea of it not being history is so scary,
Yes.
because you run into some pretty fundamental problems with your faith once you acknowledge that.
Right. If your faith hinges on the idea that this has to be true, then um, if that's challenged, boy, you lash out.
Yeah, I mean, even things like this, Christ being a second Adam. I mean, for multiple versions of Christianity, that's an essential doctrine, and yeah, and, obviously things develop later, but I do think there are angles where you can open someone's mind, and I think the literacy is like one of the best ones, because people can understand, oh yeah, if there's a very small group of people who are literate and most people are not, that's going to create opportunities for people to do, maybe less than savory things. I will say you're right that this is. I think there's a folklore element, right, where it's not always nefarious. That it's not like they're making stories up for to necessarily get monetary gain. I don't think that was as big a deal. I think it was just, here's a common story. I mean, oral tradition was like, and I think still is, correct me if I'm wrong, but definitely used to be a very important part of Judaism, especially early Judaism.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, storytelling is who we are. We
Yeah.
learn through stories. And that has continued through the rabbinic periods, medieval period, um, into the modern era, where stories are how we learn. And the whole idea that, you know, this actually happened, or that Moses wrote the Torah from Genesis to Deuteronomy, completely ruins that idea of Judaism.
Yeah, definitely. So eventually these things were written down. I think you mentioned that briefly. But when did those writings become sacred?
Hard to tell from a scholarship point of view. Parts of it became sacred. Well, let me put it this way: all of them were always sacred in a way, just a different way than we think about it. But parts of it became law, and divine in certain ways, and taken that way. Um, I think there was great turmoil after 587 BCE, when the first temple was destroyed and the theology became um, transformed. Because if you believe at the time, and they did, that their God, in terms of monolatry, their God was the most powerful God, and a Babylonian people come in and destroy the house of your God, that either means one of two things. One, that your God wasn't the strongest God, or that your God was so strong that he allowed this to happen because it's your fault. And so those elements, which still continue today, by the way, and happened again in 70 CE, and much elsewhere, those prompted a particular kind of adherence to God and to sacredness, um, in order for self-preservation in the face of monolatry and the ideas of monotheism. um, the school of monotheism, which won out, um, that it's just one God and all the other gods don't exist, which is very different from how things actually were for a long, long time. Everybody had their own gods, and then our God was the king god, or the chief god of the council, and all this, or whatever it is. But once the school of monotheism won out, that's when you start to see, at least in my research and opinion, a more move towards a more adherence and immovable aspects to sacredness in Jewish texts. Things that are born out of fear and loss and guilt, more so than some of the positive things that used to exist. Um, and I think some of that happened when the temple was destroyed. Some of it happened post-exilic, but certainly late, maybe Persian period, that sort of stuff. That's when we really start to see a transition into um, this biblical literalism literalism through monotheism in that way. And that's something I'm trying my best to piece it together in a without doing an hour lecture, so I'm trying my best to give you the highlights, um, but it's fascinating to see, what the scribes and the scholars and the redactors and the everyday Jew at the time, um, would have or maybe did think about, and were told or were taught at the time with those sort of things. But like I said, it's a very late idea of the Torah drops out of the sky, written by the
Right.
hand of God.
Well, yeah, it's so fascinating, isn't it? And yeah, you and I are both probably of the nerdy variety that wants to get into it and find that exact date and, like figure stuff
I'd
out.
love to. I'd love to.
Um,
Yeah.
things are unfortunately a little more fluid than that. And I will say, to my audience that might either be a deconstructed Christian or still a Christian or whatever, that, it might be jarring to be like, wait, when it became monotheism, I'm like, you can actually look at your own Old Testament and I can go as simple as the 10 Commandments, put no other gods before me. Um, the idea of multiple gods is not like a crazy new age way of looking back. It's just an accurate way of understanding how things developed.
Yeah. I mean, Judaism and the Israelite religion was certainly more monolatrous than monotheistic for a long time. And even later, when the monotheistic school went out, there were still little bits that you could find of people fighting against it. You can see, uh, you know, things like Psalm 82 or Psalm 74, multiple, differing theological ideas that shows us, they were there. That's how we know they were there, because they were written down. Um, it really wasn't until much later that monotheism sort of erased and went back and attempted to erase, through interpretation, these ideas of polytheism and monolatry. I mean, even as you mentioned, the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, depending on which one, isn't even necessarily monotheistic. Um, the first commandment would say, "I'm the only God. There are no other gods." Not, "You will not put other gods. You know, you'll put other gods before me." That means there might be an existence of other gods. I'm just the best one, the head god, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I've
Um,
said before, the gaudiest god of all gods. Yeah.
exactly, the gaudiest god of all gods. Much later, right? Jeremiah and other, and Second Kings and things like that. You'll start to see um, you'll start to see prophets mock, the priests of Baal or whatever it is, and be like, maybe you're not praying hard enough, to, your God doesn't exist. Um, but that, again, the fact that school won out is amazing. Um, Probably because most people had no say in it. Probably was a small group of people um, who made that win out, but it took away all the fun, frankly, of what was sort of this living, breathing council of Babylonian gods and Egyptian gods and Canaanite and Hittite, and I mean, much cooler of an idea that our
Much more
God.
fun for the imagination, for sure.
Yes, so much more
Better
fun.
literature too.
Yes, it is better literature.
Yeah.
It's not as simplistic or scary. It allows people to be who they want to be. You've got your God, I've got my God. That's fine. Um, it's much more sort of live and let live. There's not an idea of sort of conquering one another. Unless your God wants to beat up that God, which is like, okay, fine, but we know nothing about why, and that's the fun part of Israelite religion, and it sort of got taken away from us by the monotheistic school.
Yeah, definitely. And that was probably only amplified by Paul later on.
Oh, good Lord, yeah.
Oh gosh. Okay. So, this is probably a really important question for my audience. They might be itching for it by this point. What would be a Jewish understanding of a Messiah?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Um, so I think the best way to describe this is sort of in contrast with the Christian ideas. So, from a Jewish point of view, the term Messiah, which is our term, it's a English translation of Mashiach, which means the anointed one, and whoever was in charge at the time, kings or prophets, were anointed with oil in the presence of the community to denote their authority. So when Joshua takes over, he's anointed, that sort of stuff. So um, the Messiah or the Mashiach rather, in Jewish tradition and understanding varies. I mean, again, I could teach a whole course on the evolution of messianism within Judaism, but the overall message is that um, when when the Mashiach comes, there is no sort of missing it, right? The Mashiach brings what is called the world to come, uh, where um, the world as we know it completely changes. In certain Jewish tradition, all Jews who have died are resurrected, and we bury them with our feet pointed towards Jerusalem because we're supposed to get up and start walking towards Jerusalem. The Mashiach is supposed to be sort of a ruler king who is, by the way, completely mortal, not in any way connected with being a part of God in any way, simply a handpicked sort of person to guide people into the next plane of existence. The Olam Haba, the world to come, God and humans sort of unite together in peace and common worship, whether that means everyone turns Jewish or everyone turns something. But God is recognized by the entire world in a certain way. And there is an end to, you know, war, famine, disease, starvation, violence. All of it ends. Before that, there are what's called the birth pangs of the Messiah. Volcanoes erupting, huge earthquakes. Um, there's legends about uh, certain countries doing certain things or certain rulers doing certain things. And so you have all of these people who are, watching climate change and watching world politics and saying, does this represent this? But no, we're talking about on a global scale. You would not miss it, basically. There's no way to miss the Messiah coming in Jewish tradition. The entire world as you know it changes before your eyes. There's a Jewish story of a rabbi is studying, and someone comes to his window and says, the Messiah is here. And the rabbi looks out his window, looks around, and he says, nothing's changed, and goes back to studying, right? That's how we know, right? You look out the window, if the world looks the same, the Messiah hasn't come yet. So there's more to that, obviously, and it gets into more complexities with what the evolution of Messianism through, first century Judaism, the Qumranites, Pharisaic ideas, rabbinical ideas, medieval ideas. It all sort of evolves, but one of the major reasons why Jews as a whole rejected Jesus as a Messiah, as a messianic figure, was because nothing changed. the horrible aspects of life still exist. People are still dying, and people are still starving and killing each other. That is not the Messianic age. And while Jesus believed that the kingdom of God, his version of the Olam Haba, the world to come, would come in his time, it did not. And he ended up dying, which he's not supposed to do. It was a mess from a theological point of view in Judaism, and very easily rejected, which is why Christianity, or Jewish Christians at the time, turned their sights towards the Gentiles, the pagans, which liked that story a lot better. But yeah, it's Messianism in Judaism is fascinating, but it's extremely different from Christian ideas of Messianism.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception among Christians that Jews were all waiting for a Messiah, like in this kind of like, because there were probably sects that were super focused on that, but Judaism was much more complex than a bunch of people waiting for one person to come. That it's a
Right.
really reductive lens to look at the whole religion through.
It is. And I think, again, that's part of the problem with Christian misunderstanding Judaism. They only see Judaism through the lens of Christian idealism, and they miss the point and the complexity of Judaism. Even who Jews are and what we think, and all of that is missed because it's through the ideas of the simplistic ideas of Christianity, right? All you need is that one liner, and you're good. And that one line has never worked for Jews. We have books and books and libraries and libraries, at least the ones that the Christians haven't destroyed, but libraries and libraries of what ifs and what does this mean, and that's Judaism. Study, not creed.
It's also just like a way bigger umbrella than I think Christians can even imagine. Like, because even though, yeah, you're right, there's the 40,000 denominations, the push comes to shove, they're going to agree on basic tenets, even if it's begrudgingly. Like, they're still going to have to say, yeah, I guess that's the basics,
Right. Right.
Um, and so, yeah, Judaism is much different. I actually wanted to ask you this. So I often, to try to jolt someone in a conversation, will just say that Jesus and the apostles were Jewish. Could that ever be problematic, framing it that way?
Absolutely. 100%.
Okay.
So not the Jesus part. Jesus certainly lived and died as a Jew. Worshipped as a Jew, studied Judaism, was well aware of Pharisaic ideas, quoted Torah scripture, taught things that we know Hillel and other rabbinic mind study. He was through and through a Jew, which I think people really should. Again, the one-liner is Jesus was a Jew, but it's, if you go into it more, there's so much wonderful aspects to learn about first century Judaism and who this historical character of Jesus was, who lived and died as a Jew. Now, when it comes to the apostles, one, whether they existed or not, right? Who existed and what kind of Jew they were is a little bit more complex. Yes, they were Jewish, first century Jews, but they had also broken off by following now what we would call in the first century the Jesus movement, before it became Christianity much later. And so at that point they are engaging in a messianic offshoot of what was first century Judaism, whether that was Sadducee, Pharisee, and Essene, whatever it is. They created something new. And so, yes, they were Jews, but they were an offshoot of Judaism. And this happens, by the way, throughout history all the time. Within Judaism, there are messianic figures that occur. Some even, within, modern history, right? I mean, there are ultra orthodox Chabadniks who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was the Messiah. But once you do that, you let go of sort of the central doctrines of Judaism. And so, yes, they were Jewish, but ellipsis, what's
Yeah,
really,
I think that's right because I'll
yeah,
acknowledge I'll be like they were a Jewish sect, and I'll try to clarify. Obviously, a lot of what I do is podcasting, so as you and I
yeah,
are both aware, you can't always say everything. Um, but so it's probably okay to emphasize the Judaism of Jesus more so than the apostles. Is that fair?
yes, 100%. And, you know, again, from a historical point of view, we have to say that, this is where it gets complicated. The gospel writers, on the other hand, were not Jewish. When people say that the gospel writers were Jewish, that's when they're incorrect. They were through and through Jewish Christians at that point. They had completely separated themselves from the Jewish community. And you can start to see, not as early as Mark, which was 72 CE, maybe a little bit, but as you get into Matthew, Luke, and certainly by John, you can start to see just how far away they are. They're not talking about internal issues anymore. They are looking at Judaism from the outside. And so if you think about it that way, and you start to read the quote unquote life and ministry of Jesus, the 3-year ministry of Jesus, through the lens of these gospel writers who were no longer Jewish, you have to start to question what was really going on. What's the agenda? There's a great deal of self-preservation going on. And that's where you really have to sit down with your local Christian and say, look, it's as easy as this. Jews were a very small group in the Roman Empire, but they rebelled. Insurrection was a huge trigger for them, for the Romans, whether it be from 70 CE or the Bar Kokhba rebellion, or even before that, there were other rebellions. And so if you're a Jewish Christian writing after the temple falls, in Mark or later in Matthew, and you see what happens to insurrectionists, and Jesus himself was an insurrectionist because he fought against the power of Rome, you have to call him something else and separate yourself from the Jews. And you have to rewrite the story so that the Romans are the good guys and the Jews are the bad guys. And then you start to really understand how ahistorical, non-historical the Gospels are. And you have to throw away all of those questions we just asked, like how Jewish was Jesus? We have no idea. We know very little about him from a historical point of view outside the Christian doctrine. Who were the
Right.
apostles and when? All of that starts to deconstruct right before your eyes. And so those first questions become sort of irrelevant
Sure.
once the later questions are answered. And then when you try to go back, you have to say, well, we don't know.
Yeah.
Most likely Jesus was a charismatic insurrectionist Jewish person, like many people were. He had a lot of followers, which scared and bothered, Pilate, who was this ruthless killer, not at all like he was presented in the Gospels. He was just a vicious person, and had Jesus crucified next to most likely hundreds of other insurrectionists, during that time period. And that was the end of the story until 45 years later, when someone decides to write a new story about him. And that's where
Absolutely.
we go from there.
Well, and I've had to say the caveat before when I talk about the things I like about Jesus. I always go based on what's reported. Like you do
Yes.
kind of have to caveat it quite a bit,
Yes.
because there is so much uncertainty. And a good analogy, to understand the complexity of this. Imagine someone writing about Donald Trump in 1990 in 2020, and
Right.
then again in 2050. Like we're
Right.
talking about way different lenses that the writers are looking through. I mean, it's very difficult to write that long after someone's died, with any
Correct.
kind of certainty about the accuracy of what you're writing.
even if whoever this person Mark was, who's the closest gospel writer, he was not one of Jesus's followers, but even if, you know, he had some sort of connection, we're talking about 40 years, which was almost 2 generations at the time. And so I call it trying to write the biography or autobiography of your grandfather. You might have a few stories, but you certainly don't know the details, and you have to find some filler.
Definitely.
You know,
So going back to kind of this idea of an Old Testament in Christian Bibles, like I actually liked preaching from the Old Testament back when I preached. I liked the Old Testament more than the New Testament because I think I was always anti-Paul, whether I could acknowledge it or not.
right?
But a lot of people really didn't like preaching from the Old Testament, but certainly many Christian pastors do, especially, the greatest hits, as it were, the
Yeah.
things that really point to Jesus in their mind. So should Christian pastors preach from the Old Testament? Is there anything inappropriate about doing that?
Man, these are such wonderfully loaded questions. I want to see where I can start. So here's what I'll say. There is an inherent issue in dealing in typology and prophesizing of Jesus's and retroactively placing Christian ideas and Jesus in the Old Testament. One, it destroys thousands of years of Jewish understanding and Jewish commentary and Jewish interpretation, which is, I guess, what I would say simply not nice. But if you're going to preach from the Old Testament, well, let me put it this way, I guess. If you're preaching from the Old Testament, you're preaching from a book that is meant to lead to Jesus. You're not preaching from the Hebrew Bible. And so you're preaching from a book that has been reworked and retranslated and reinterpreted to point towards the New Testament. That in itself, from a Jewish point of view, is inappropriate, but we're not in church. It's your church. You can sort of do what you like, but you are not reading Jewish stories in the way that Jewish stories are supposed to be preached from. You're not, your greatest hits are not our greatest hits, and your greatest hits are the wrong hits, and so I'm not sure it's inappropriate to do that. If you wish to preach on those sort of things, that's fine. I would say that Christians are allowed to do that. What I wish is that there was sort of an asterisk attached to it and say, just a reminder, this is a Christian interpretation of these texts. Jews have a completely different understanding. They're not wrong. We're not right. It's just a different understanding. And if you do that, you can do whatever you want. The ideas of supersessionism and replacement theology, that Jews don't know their own texts and that Christians know Jewish texts better than Jews, that's where it gets inappropriate. Like, how do Jews not see Jesus in this? And they're wrong. That's a horrible thing to preach. That's, that's intellectual colonialism, or imperialism, basically. Like, you're taking over.
I was gonna say it's horrible way to preach, and it is evangelicalism. It that's what it does. There really isn't an evangelical understanding of Christianity that doesn't inherently say Jews missed it, don't you miss it. I mean, that's that's kind of how, I mean, that's how what I grew up hearing. I remember one little pet theology. I always like looking back on when I was a Christian and seeing like the little hints of deconstruction early on. And one of them was, I was baptized as an infant, and it's very common in Protestant circles to say baptism replaced circumcision.
Yeah.
And
Circumcision of the heart. Yes.
and it was just like I literally from teenager to adulthood was trying to find any scriptural justification for it, right? Like,
Right.
like I would be sent verses by pastors and my dad or whatever, and I'd be like, it's not there. Like, I just don't see that anywhere.
Right.
So even in college, there was this whole stupid debate about dispensationalism versus covenant theology. Spoiler alert, they're both wrong.
Right.
Um, but like I was more on the covenant theology side, and they're like, "Oh, so you just believe in replacement theology?" And I was like, "No, that's not where I'm coming from." But it is part of it, right? Where people think there was this old covenant and now there's this new covenant, and that's why we don't pay attention as much to the Old Testament. I don't think that's true.
Right.
This is what I think. I
Right.
think evangelicals keep the Old Testament in there. They keep their claim of the Old Testament. Don't acknowledge anything with those asterisks that we wish they would have,
Right.
because it gives them more credence. It gives them it's an argument from authority. Basically, it's like, this is how old we are. We're even before Jesus. But
Right.
they don't typically actually want to study anything in there. Because frankly, even if you study the Old Testament, the not the Hebrew Bible, but the actual Old Testament that Christians chose once upon a time, it's actually really inconsistent with most Christian views.
Right.
Or I don't know. Do you think I'm right on that, or am I going a bridge too far here?
No. I mean, we're doing our best with with the time that we have, right? In terms of having this conversation, which is fruitful no matter what. But I think if you were to read the Hebrew Bible, and learn with Jews and rabbis, by the time you get to first century Judaism, after Second Temple Judaism, and you start to, if you were to study, the Gospels and all that sort of stuff, it would not make a lot of sense. You would have a hard time making those connections. And that's why Jesus was so easily rejected. Because Jews at the time, the Pharisees knew their stuff. And this was not it. And if you study the Old Testament and read the stories of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, there are some exceedingly far leaps of faith that you have to take to get to Jesus. And it's hard work. I say this as a Jew and a biblical scholar, who has studied Christian scripture and Hebrew scripture for my adult life. It's not a strong connection. And once you start to see that, the whole thing sort of unravels. And so I think Christians would benefit from, and I say this genuinely, Christians would benefit from studying Jewish texts, not to erase their ideas of Christianity, but to just give them a little bit more perspective on the what happened with the construction of the Christian ideas and Jesus, and that it's not a one-way highway that you just start picking up verses, starting in Genesis, and it all leads that way. I mean, it's just a little more complicated, and I think people shouldn't fear complication so much.
I couldn't agree more. Here's where I see the problem, though, is American Christianity. Even the more kind of progressive types that are starting to gain even more traction recently. It's still very individualistic. It's an individualistic understanding of faith. And
Right.
yet somehow it also at the same time produces very insular communities. And I know you're very interested in interfaith dialogue, and I think that's great. And I think, even though I'm more on the lack of faith spectrum, I'm still very interested in it.
Right.
But does interfaith academia actually reach like cultists? Does it reach people who are kind of in these more narrow cults?
No. I mean, not even close. Not even close. I have worked my butt off to get into as many churches as possible, talking to as many priests and ministers and pastors and, as possible. And there are just some doors that do not open. There are some tables that they will not join us, because even before the cults, you get to the more fundamentalists, and they will not even sit at the table. you know, Assembly of God will not come near us, right? Some of the Baptist ones will not come near us. Evangelicals have no interest in sitting with us except to proselytize, right? An opportunity for an agenda, right? We don't get that far. And I struggle so hard to comprehend it. But there is this inherent weakness within these fundamentalist denominations that any outside perspective is a threat. That is not the sign of a strong faith. That is the sign of a weak faith. That you could be that swayed that you could, plant the seed of doubt and your entire congregation would disappear. You're holding your congregation hostage with two hands, basically. And so they're so cautious that they won't go near us for that. So we don't get near them. I've tried over and over again with no success. And I've seen some horrible situations that arose when some of the more progressive Christians attempted to do something with some of the more fundamentalist Christian ideas. We did an MLK service, and I was invited, and a Muslim was invited to speak. And when we got there, the Muslim was not allowed to speak because the white evangelicals said, "We're not going to give you any more funding or money if this person speaks," that sort of thing. And, they tear down the bridges before you can even walk across them.
Wow. I mean, saddened but not surprised,
Right.
It's just all too common. And, I've been lucky enough that I know, this podcast has broken through to a few people, but it's usually people who are kind of looking for a way out. And it is really hard to know what to do with the people who are so afraid that they are so turning to that monolith, turning to that simplicity. Because I think you and I both care about those people still. It's just really hard to reach them. Because we do understand that, you probably are really scared. You probably are really traumatized. You probably have real life stuff you need to deal with. And I feel for that. But in the meantime, they're part of a cult. And, I heard you say this more or less. I'll paraphrase. But yeah, Christianity in some senses is kind of an offshoot cult of Judaism, at least foundationally. I'll ask you this. Do you think Christianity is more subject to being cult-like than Judaism is?
I think so, yes. Not necessarily because of the New Testament, but because of church canon. People like Augustine and other things like that. I mean, church doctrine and dogma were what transformed it more into a cult than anything else, in a very scary scary way. But yes, that being said, Judaism is not immune by any means. We have had our fair share of cultic offshoots, as I said, even in modern times. But yes, I do think church doctrine and creed and those sorts of things make Christianity more susceptible to those fundamentalist and cultic ideas, and are a little bit more dangerous. And I don't think that's unfair to say. I think that there are just some writings that are scary in that way, and
Yeah.
are just
I
different.
obviously agree.
No, I try to be truthful, but I also try to be respectful in the fact that,
Sure.
and fair in the fact that, look, Judaism has I mean, if you read about Shabbatai Zvi, who is very much like a like a Trumpian figure, frankly, historically, but and the MAGA idea, there are MAGA Jews, and that to me I think is very cultic, and there are certain aspects of Chabad that I think are cultic. And ultra orthodoxy, which scares people from leaving and shames people. I mean, very cultic. But there was just the men who got a hold of Christian dogma and started to build within the Catholic framework with money and corruption. I mean, they built sort of an inescapable connection to and susceptibility to a cult.
Yeah, there's a shame-based theology that I think lends itself stronger in Christianity. I mean, obviously other religions have some shame-based theology here or there, but like
right.
in general, Christianity is really honed in on it.
Yes.
And I think also there's a lot of hierarchy in just church structure, in Christian church structure. There's just a lot of hierarchy, just implicitly, and a lot of in Catholic churches, it's very stark, right? Different garb for priests and that kind of thing.
Right.
But in a very authoritative way, because I think there can be some cultic aspects to like some rituals and certain other things can kind of hypnotize your congregants a little bit, and like make them easier to manipulate. But I do agree. I think Christianity kind of started as a cult and has always continued to be that.
Sure. And I think that there is, that is worthy of study. And, I think it's legitimate. I admit I'm at a loss. I haven't read your book, but I assume I would like it because we agree
it's fine.
on so much.
The next one will be better.
Okay. I'm in the process of writing my second book as well, but that might take a little bit longer. But the idea is, I think overall, what we're fighting against is the urge for simplicity. We fight this in Christianity. We see this now in MAGA Republican ideas that one-liners, and these fortune cookie verses and signs, verses on a signs, that's easy to understand and easy to get hooked. Complexity can be scary to people. If it doesn't fit in a tweet, right, 145 characters, then like people will reject it outright. It's why Trump was so charismatic on Twitter. He could write these one-liners that were extremely charismatic and carry millions of people with him, whether they were complete lies or not. And that is a child of what charismatic prophets or false messiahs or whatever it is used to do. They would stand on the corner and yell one-liners and catch somebody who was vulnerable or scared or curious or uneducated or whatever it is, to follow. And once you got them, you got them. And so I think all religion is, at least Western religions, are susceptible to that. But I think you're right that Christianity took it and ran with it. And it has been a source of power and control for a long time. And what's sad is, within Judaism, we do see some of that within the ultra-Orthodox and fundamentalist side. It is far more endemic, even within the moderate and hinging on progressive sides of Christianity as well. And that's why it makes it so scary.
I could not say it better myself. Rabbi Mike, thank you for coming on. This was excellent. Really enjoyed this conversation. If people want to buy your book or find out more about you, how do they do that?
Pretty easy. I'm very easily findable. www.rabbimichaelharvey.com. I'm Rabbi Harvey on Twitter. The book, Let's Talk, A Rabbi Speaks to Christians, can be found on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and next week we should see the audiobook out. Also Barnes & Noble and other sort of big box bookstores. So very, very easy to find. And I'll just add that my bread and butter has always been speaking to individual Christians, whether it be Christian leaders or Christians in general. So never be afraid to send me a Twitter message or an email with a question, because even with the 8,000 followers or whatever it is, I make time to answer those questions and take those questions seriously. And so I'm always available to help answer questions from my Christian friends.
That's awesome. I love that. Thank you so much for coming on. Legitimately, this has been so fun.
Awesome. It's been great. And anytime, I'm here to chat. And I think this was awesome. So thank you.
Yeah, I love to hear that. And thank you, listener, for stopping by. I'll talk to you all soon. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast or other work I'm doing, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for $5 through Spotify for additional content, or give as much or as little as you can to support this work through links in the show's notes. Every dollar helps further this important discussion as well as start other exciting projects. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.